Hey, hey! Ready for another story time? Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video, I often get asked a lot, so I thought I'd do a video on it. How I started writing and when I started publishing. So I'll tell you the little story of the baby Kyle that began to write and how I went to publishing my first book and how the dream just became bigger and bigger and bigger. So let's go! The books that first really started me loving fantasy and loving young adult, particularly when I was around 14, 15, was Cassandra Clare and Kristen Cashore and Rochelle Mead. So love those authors. And I was really inspired by City of Bones and that entire series. And I remember in class, I wasn't a rebel per se, but I liked to keep to myself. When I was learning in high school, I self-taught. So I would write down the notes, whatever the teacher wrote on the board, and then I would teach myself it later. Not all of them enjoyed that, but I knew how my brain worked and that was best for me. Anyway, so in class, I would often just read my books. When I was 15, my family home got burnt down, so our entire house burnt down, and we lost everything. So then in that week I got really sick, and then we had to write down all the things that was in our property, all our possessions. It was an interesting learning lesson for me at that age to realize that material possessions weren't everything in life, because when you have everything taken away from you and you start afresh, it's definitely gonna teach you something. Anyway, but it was after that I actually started writing. So when I was so influenced by reading young adult, and then I had that happen to me, I was rather angsty. And I first started writing the 3 Immortal Blades series when I was 15. So somehow all of those things built when I was just an angsty, angry teen, and I found writing was a really good way for me to, I guess, process or channel some of that into the theme of Possession of My Soul, where again, she was a teenager herself. And I guess in a sense, that's how I could really relate to Carla. But that's when I first started writing. So I had another 2 years in high school and I continued writing throughout that. And it's funny because I don't have the best memory of my childhood and my younger years, but even people to this day always say to me, I remember when you kept continuously talking about how you were going to publish a book and you were writing books. And it blows my mind because I remember being in grade 12, right near the end of graduating, and I'd finished my first manuscript of Possession of My Soul. And I was like, I sent it to, I think it was like 6 traditional publishers. I was like, I am the next like Cassandra Clare, I'm the next J.K. Rowling. This is going to go off. People are going to love what I've written. And I, of course, learned that my book wasn't up to scratch. It wasn't what they were after, you know, all the stuff you learn in this industry. But I was so young and I was so ready to get into it, and I had no idea what I was getting into. So I took those rejections rather personally. So I parked that car. I decided, oh, okay, I'm not good enough for this. Not realizing that there was options for self-publishing because I was only 17. I graduated high school, I went straight into the workforce. I started studying freelance journalism, and then I got a job in my local newspaper, and I was doing sales there. And I really wanted that job because I wanted to watch the journalists and see if it was something for me. And after about 6 months, I realized journalism did not look like what I wanted to do. And a personal thing again, but I just found that some of the questions that they would ask and pry was just too personal, and I couldn't imagine putting myself in that situation to write about such a personal and deep theme of somebody's life and put it on paper. That just wasn't for me. So at this point I was 19, so when I realized that journalism wasn't for me, I had already written 2 books. I had written Possession of My Soul and Phantom Wolf. So again, I had continued writing during those years because it was a form of self-expression. It's what I loved. So I decided when I was 19, I was going to self-publish. So I started looking into how to self-publish, and I went through so many ups and downs to get there because I had no idea what I was doing. I was 19. And I was working full-time as well. I was working full-time. I was working a part-time job, nights and weekends at a fish and chip shop as well. And I was trying to write more books and publish. So I learned very quickly all the things that I had to do to make that book come to reality. And those 6 months were intense, but it was an amazing learning curve. And I remember when I published my first book, I had all my friends come to it. I was in a country town then, and I had all my friends. I invited everyone, previous work colleagues, family friends, family. I invited everyone to this pub to celebrate my release day. So that was my first release party, and I did not receive my books in time. Thinking on the spot, how could I go about this? I cried, obviously, because it was meant to be a massive, amazing release. And it somewhat flopped, so instead I wrote IOU cards to all of my friends that had purchased a copy. They paid on the day still, and I did some signings, and I took photos with everyone because it was a really special and successful and hard-worked achievement for me. And everyone really supported me, and that was great. And it just snowballed from there. So it was only 6 weeks later that I released Fan and Wolf, my next book. And then I did guest speaking at my local library. And then I just kept writing, and I just kept learning more and more and more. And I started meeting people on social medias, and I started networking, and I started learning how to market, because when I first hit send, when I first published my book, I thought it would take off like that. And it didn't, because I realized I needed to put the work in. I needed to push this book home. So I was working so many hours on just networking, marketing, promoting, and how I could get into guest speaking, how I could get into libraries and bookstores. And it just kept growing and growing and growing. And a lot of the readers that I had gained were Americans. So of course I wanted to go over to America. I wanted to see the US for my own eyes. And I decided, I think within 3 years of, writing books and then starting to go to conventions and signings, I decided to start my own little international tour over in the States. So I went to different bookstores and universities and such, and I did signings, and my mind kept growing and growing and growing larger. I came from being a small country town girl to realizing there was more, and there was more than my country town. There was a city, and then with a city there was a world. Like, there was the entire world, and it was my oyster. I could do and achieve anything. And I don't think I would have really realized any of that if it weren't for my books, because I was always a tad shy. But I really wanted my books, and I still do want them to be such a massive success. So I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing myself out of my comfort zone. And it was because I was, in a sense, originally hiding behind my books, because I wanted them to be the success. And then I realized about halfway through, a couple of years ago, that I was the success as well. And so that's really how I started writing, and how I've got to where I am today. And so that's my story. I've just always constantly pushed and pushed and pushed, taken myself out of my comfort zone, created opportunity for myself, and have always try to get my books into the best hands. So that is how I started writing. I started off as a small country girl at 15. It was a way of self-expression, and now it's still a way of self-expression. I'm just a mature young woman living my best life, and I couldn't have done that without writing, or without publishing my books, or being an author, or being career-driven such as I am. So that's my story. I hope you enjoyed it. I would love to hear how you started on your writing journey and what ticked it over for you. And I'll talk to you soon. Thank you guys. Bye.